Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Blyth. I'm the director of the Rhodes Center for International Economics and Finance at the Watson Institute at Brown University. Welcome to the last talk that we'll be doing in this sadly truncated semester, this COVID semester, but hopefully we'll be back to more normal service when we reconvene in the fall. It's with great pleasure that I can bring on today Aaron Benanav, who's written this wonderfully interesting book about automation and the future of work. And just when you thought everything that could be said about this has been said, race against the machine, all the rest of it, Aaron actually does, I think, something very interesting and very credible in my view, which is he looks at this on the historical long run. He's not just looking at the latest inflection point of technology. And in doing so, he draws upon a thesis first popularized by the economic historian Robert Brenner about 50 years ago about the relationship between unemployment, slow growth, and stagnation because of overaccumulation at the level of the global economy. And I want to bring Aaron in to share that talk with us today in the new book that he's got out on this, because I think it's a very important intervention. Before I formally introduce him, just a couple of words on housekeeping. If you've been here before, you'll know how we do this. And I guess on Zoom, everybody does a version of this. We're going to do the talk for about 30 to 35 minutes, at the end of which we will be happy to take questions. If you're a member of the Brown community and you're logged in through Brown, then you can just put it in the Q&A at any point, and I will read out that question when we get to the end. If you're watching this on YouTube live, put it in the comments. And we've got people watching those comments, and they will cut and paste that and put it into the Q&A so that your questions get answered as well. So without any further ado, I will then formally introduce Aaron and pass control over to him. So Aaron Benanav is a postdoctoral researcher at Humboldt University in Berlin and is the academic coordinator for the research unit Reallocation in the Cluster of Excellence Scripts, Contestations of the Liberal Script, a 7-year project funded by the German Research Foundation. I'd like to just pause for a minute and go, a 7-year funded project? You don't get too many of those things anymore. That's pretty amazing. Benanav also serves as the editorial board member for the journal International Labour and Working Class History. His first book, this one, Automation and the Future of Work, by the way, what a first book. That's amazing to have that as your first book, appeared with Verso in November 2020. He's currently working on a second book on the global history of unemployment since World War II. Before joining Humboldt, Benanav was a Harper Schmidt Fellow at the in Social Sciences at the University of Chicago, and he holds a PhD in history from the University of California, Los Angeles. Hence the Brenner connection, no doubt, in that case.
Yeah.
All right, Aaron, it's brilliant to have you here. Please tell us something that we don't know about something that we think we know well.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm just going to share my slides here. Are we looking good?
Yes, we're looking good.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about my book, Automation and the Future of Work. The talk I'm going to give today is really drawn from the second and third chapters of that book, but I'll just say a little bit about the context and the other claims. So the starting point for the book is the rise or reemergence of a new story or discourse about automation. So automation theorists have claimed that we're living in an age of accelerating technological change. They argue that jobs are being destroyed at such a rapid pace that the labor market is unable to recover. And the question that I ask in my book is very simple. It's just, is this true? Is this the end of work? In other words, is automation responsible for the growing difficulties that workers face in finding or holding on to jobs today? The argument that I'm going to make is as follows. I'm going to provide a descriptive narrative analysis to show that the automation theorist's account actually can't possibly be right. The pace of technological change that they identify as accelerating, in fact, only appears to be speeding up. The real issue I will show is that economic growth rates have been slowing down. And it's this slowdown that's generating a persistently low demand for labor, which is making the lives of workers very difficult in the economy even before the Corona crisis, and then of course, very bad during it. And that low demand for labor in turn provides the key backdrop, I say, to the expansion of insecure work in the digital economy. So today in this brief talk, I'm just going to give you some background on technologies and labor market conditions, talk about some theoretical approaches to the problem, discuss the cases and sources I use, and then I'm going to give you some detail about what the sector I focus on the most in those early chapters, the manufacturing sector, and then talking a bit more about slow growth in service-based economies and the labor market consequences. So just some background first. The automation theorists that I discuss in my book, who are widely distributed across academia, in the news media, politicians, and other social commentators, really focus on just a few major apparent breakthroughs. One, advanced industrial robotics, which you can see here in the Tesla plant in Fremont, California, where Elon Musk has been pushing towards lights out production. Alongside industrial robotics, of course, we have breakthroughs in machine learning, which some people think will push us towards a kind of new form of artificial general intelligence. And then alongside the rise of these more automating technologies, we also have another technology, which is less discussed in this literature, but very important for the digital economy. And that, of course, is the platform economy, like Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, TaskRabbit, and so on. Now, while these technologies have been coming online and transforming different parts of the economy, we've also seen a number of rather disturbing labor market trends. So on the one hand, we have here, this is for the United States, the so-called pattern of jobless recoveries. And what you can see in this graph, it's the length of time it takes for the labor market to recover after a recession, how long it takes for employment to recover its pre-recession peak. And what you can see is that after recessions in the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, and the later 2000s, the global financial crisis, it took longer and longer for the labor market to recover. And this is why people are very frightened about the consequences of corona-induced employment last year and this year. Now, this isn't only a story. The story of weak labor markets isn't only a story about unemployment, which is shown here, but also about underemployment, about the way that when people get jobs, many of the jobs that they've gotten have underpaid them in terms of wages, they've underemployed them in terms of the skills they've acquired, and offer worse working conditions. And we can kind of get an indication of this from looking at the so-called wages productivity gap. Now, you may have seen this graph before for the United States, a very famous graph of the divergence of productivity growth from wage growth. Less well known is that this is actually happening across the entire OECD, across all of the wealthy countries. We see a growing gap between wages and between productivity growth and average wage growth, as well as median wage growth. And that really suggests that for people in the bottom half of the labor market, they've seen really stagnating wages across many countries. So the question or a claim made by the automation theorists is that there's some deep connection between these technological innovations and labor market trends. Now, there's a few ways to kind of go a little deeper into this and explore what could be those connections between the technologies and the labor market trends. So one way to approach it would, of course, be as a pure technology story. And there we might think about, kind of single axis with different technologies arrayed on it. On the one hand, technologies that augment human labor power. So those are technologies that don't replace workers, but make workers more productive. And then moving from the right-hand side to the left, we might think about automating technologies that really replace workers, right? And so as a pure technology story, we want to investigate to what extent are the contemporary technologies automating rather than augmenting in character. Now, studies that have been done of this have given kind of contrasting results. A very famous study, the Oxford-Martin study, originally released as a working paper in 2013 and then replicated all over the internet, suggested that about half of jobs today were at a high risk of automation. The OECD, MIT, and others have rerun the numbers, and they've shown a much lower risk of contemporary technologies automating everyone out of work. They say that only 14% of current technologies are likely to be automating at some point in the future, with the rest of the ones identified by the Oxford-Martin study more augmenting than automating in character. Now, these disagreements did not prevent the emergence of a really massive automation discourse, especially around the middle years of the 2010s. And as I said, this has been, among academic economists, futurists. It includes people from the right, the center, and the left. Andy Stern, former head of the SEIU, and leftists like Nick Cernicek and Aaron and Alex Williams, or Aaron Bastani's fully automated luxury communism. It's a big field of claims that these technologies really are automating. But researchers have long cast doubt on the pure technology story that's at the base of these accounts. When automation theorists tell us about what's happening with technology, they tend to show us graphs like this one, a very famous graph from Time magazine that shows the rising processing power you can buy for $1,000 at different points in time. And it shows just this exponential curve. We're getting, faster and faster computers. They're going to be as capable as a mouse brain, and then a single human brain, and then all human brains. And that will lead to the singularity that changes everything. But in fact, many researchers in society and technology studies have shown that the way these technologies that appear to just purely transform over time following preset paths, the way that they're actually implemented in production depends a lot on the social context. And my favorite example of this has to do with the assembly line. One might think that this is the way we produce cars. Cars have to be made on an assembly line. This is the most efficient way to make them. But in the 1980s and 90s, facing very tight labor markets and union pressure and a high rate of labor turnover in the automotive industry, Volvo in Sweden tried to abolish the assembly line as a way to make work more satisfying for the workers on the job. And so they replaced the assembly line with just teams of workers who assembled complete cars from start to finish in groups of 8 to 10 workers, and they were able to achieve roughly the same productivity levels as the assembly line workers in Europe at that time. Now, taking examples like this, we might think of the technology axis I showed you before as kind of intersected by a social axis that thinks about how jobs are either alienating in character for workers, or whether they give those workers autonomy, where autonomy includes things like self-directed work, whether workers are able to use skills that they've mastered, and whether they have a feeling of social purpose in the work that they're doing. And researchers associated with the Social Power or Social Resources School have shown that workers' autonomy in turn relates to their solidarity and bargaining power vis-a-vis employers. Now, kind of drawing on this material alongside the automation discourse of the 2010s, we've seen a number of undercutting social research analyses. So think about texts like Uberland by Alex Rosenblatt that showed how much Uber drivers' lives are kind of controlled by these algorithms that make their work very precarious. Ghost Work by Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri, which showed how much hidden work there is in apparently automated processes on platforms like Facebook and Instagram. Many people have to look at disturbing images in order to moderate them because it's something that the AI isn't really capable of doing. And what these studies show is that a lot of the work that remains to be done in the digital economy is tending to cluster in this zone of being relatively alienating in character. And a lot of studies kind of look at the interplays between technology and workers' experiences. But my book claims that there's really a missing variable in the stories that have been told so far, both on the side of the automation discourse and on the side of the critics of that story. And that is the macroeconomic context that I think is really left out of these accounts. We might think of the role of macroeconomics just in terms of a simple relationship between the unemployment rate and the rate of growth of wages. So this graph is just showing the dotted line is the rise and fall of the unemployment rate over time. And as the unemployment rate rises, workers' ability to demand higher wages falls, and there's a kind of inverse relationship between the two. And we might think of these periods of low wage growth as also periods in which workers are giving up a whole range of other conditions at work, and their working lives are becoming a lot less satisfying. What you can't see in this relationship between wage growth and unemployment is that it's not just what changes over the course of the business cycle, it's what's changed over the course of many business cycles in turn. And this is the process that some economists have called secular stagnation. It's the tendency of economic growth rates on average to decline over the course of many business cycles, from the late 1960s, early 1970s, down to the present. And that trend line there shows pretty significant fall in the rate of growth, from about 5% in the early 1960s to about 1.5% in the later 2010s. And that trend line doesn't actually even include the effects of the corona crisis, which would make that downward fall substantially worse. So the claim that I'm making is that this slowing growth, not accelerating technological change, is what is causing the low demand for labor, and that this low demand for labor is what encourages the digital economy to develop in ways that are deeply alienating for workers. Employers are just less likely to take workers' perspective into account in making investment decisions when workers are so hammered by the job market. Now, to go a little bit deeper into this story and to give you some examples which are drawn from my book, I'm just going to talk mostly here about 3 countries: the United States, Germany, and Japan. And that's because these are countries that are really at the technological frontier, right? This is where we would expect to see these automating processes happening most extensively. In the book, I look at a whole range of other countries outside of the core, medium and low income countries like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico. I would be happy to talk about all of that material in questions and answers. So what I want to do first in going a little bit deeper into this material is to look at the manufacturing sector. And I do that for a number of reasons. One is that we have pretty good data about the extent to which automation technologies like industrial robots have been implemented into manufacturing. So this is a very common chart from the International Federation of Robots, which shows the number of installed robots per 1,000 workers in manufacturing. And you can see there, although they're not at the very forefront, Germany, Japan, the United States are pretty high up in the list of the most automated countries. One thing to note here is that East Asian countries like South Korea, Singapore, and Japan, and European countries like Germany, Sweden, and Denmark are actually more automated, as it were, by this metric than the United States is. That's going to be important for what I say later. Another reason to focus on industry first rather than services, although services are where most of the workers in the economy are in the high income countries, is that the story of the job apocalypse in manufacturing is a story about the past. It's already, deindustrialization has already happened, whereas many of the claims about the service sector are really forward-working future claims. So you can see in this graph that there have been waves of deindustrialization unfolding across the world since the late 1960s and early 70s. This is standardly measured as the share of manufacturing employment and total employment. And you can see in country after country that manufacturing employment shares decline. And then even in relatively poor countries that were just starting out in their industrialization, they too have deindustrialized, as they say, prematurely. So to look a little bit more and to test the claim, is automation technology responsible for this deindustrialization? I'm going to have to show you just a little bit of very simple math. And all you need to know is just 3 terms and their basic meaning in order to get what I'm talking about. So maybe for many of you, this might be much more of a refresher. I just look at 3 terms. Output is just measured in terms of real value added. It's just the size, the volume of production. So the growth of output is just the growth of the volume of manufacturing production. I talk about employment, which is here measured in terms of number of employees rather than hours worked. And I look at the ratio between output and employment, which is productivity, output per worker. Now you might think to yourself, productivity seems like it'd be a pretty bad measure if what we're talking about is automation, because we're not talking about how productive workers are. We're talking about machines replacing workers. But the way they measure productivity statistics, they're not talking about what this individual worker does or contributes, but they're just talking about on average, how much output is produced, with how many hours of work. And so even if half the workforce is replaced by machines and workers aren't really doing anything additional, that would show up as a major increase in productivity, because it would mean that those fewer workers are producing much more output. There's a stylized relationship between these concepts that I use in my work, and it's just that the rate of growth of output is equal to the rate of growth of employment plus the rate of growth of productivity. Now, that's pretty hard to hold in your mind, so I'm going to give you just a few representative examples to explain what I mean, and this is really kind of the core of the story. So another way of writing that would be that the rate of growth of output minus the rate of growth of productivity equals the rate of growth of employment. And it's pretty intuitive, actually, what this means. So imagine we're talking about a car factory that has increased its output, so the volume of cars that it produces, the number of cars, by 3% a year in a given period of time. And in that time, productivity didn't grow at all. Well, that means that in order to produce that 3% growth of output, you would need 3% more people working in the factory. So 3 minus 0 equals 3. On the other hand, think about the same car factory still producing 3% more cars per year, but now the productivity of each worker in that factory has grown by 3%. Well, in that case, the existing workforce can be responsible for all of this additional output. So 3 minus 3 equals 0. I hope that's clear enough. Here's what's actually happening in the manufacturing sector in the United States. Output has been growing for some time at about 1% per year, and productivity has been growing at 3% per year. So 1 minus 3 is negative 2. That means that employment has been declining at a steady rate, or actually more cyclically, but at an average pace of 2% per year. That's a pretty extreme decline in employment. And this information is basically why the automation theorists are saying, look, this is a productivity-driven story. This is about high productivity growth resulting in us being able to produce more and more stuff with fewer and fewer workers. So that's the claim. But if you kind of zoom out and look at the same information in a longer term historical perspective, what you can see is that over the long term, and here that's that same information, but now going back to the 1950s, that middle bar, the productivity growth rate, doesn't really change very much at all. What's really happening instead is that output growth is falling. It's the rate of output growth that, as it falls over time, is resulting in more and more decline in manufacturing employment. And so that is really the key to the story that I'm telling. Now, the information I just showed you at least makes it seem like productivity growth rates have been steady since the 1950s. But I actually follow the work of economist Susan Hausman at the Upjohn Institute, who disputes these productivity numbers. She disaggregates the manufacturing sector to show that actually across much of manufacturing, we see a substantial decline in both output and productivity growth rates. There's just one sector, one subsector in manufacturing, computer and electronic products, that has seen an extraordinary increase in output growth over this period. And what Susan Hausman says is that this is actually a mismeasurement, that the US government is suggesting that faster and faster processors are equivalent to producing more and more computer processors in total. And anyone who has had a computer in the last 10 years knows that there isn't really an exact relationship between increased processor speed and having many more computers. It's not the leading indicator it used to be. So she points out that excluding this one subsector from manufacturing, subtracts 1.7% per year from the sector's labor productivity growth rates. And that actually makes manufacturing in the United States more like its competitors, Germany and Japan. This is that same information at the top that I showed you before about the United States, but now kind of comparatively with the same indicators for Germany and Japan. And there you can see that in Germany and Japan, there's been a substantial decline in productivity growth rates over time. Now, one might think, okay, well, that's just, evidence that Germany and Japan have caught up to the technological frontier like the United States. But remember that chart I showed you at the beginning. Germany and Japan actually have more robots installed in manufacturing sector firms than the United States does. And yet we see the same pattern of a decline over time, a pretty substantial decline in productivity growth rates. So what's driving the loss of employment in manufacturing in Germany and Japan? Well, it's the same process of a substantial decline in output growth rates. It's a slowdown in the rate at which manufacturing expands. Now, note here, this isn't fully true in Germany, where I happen to be located right now, because since the turn of the millennium, the German manufacturing export engine has really recovered substantially on the back of much lower wages in the manufacturing sector. And that has turned up the output growth rate in Germany in the past 20 years. That will be important a little bit later. I'm going to come back to that. So the overall point of what I've shown you so far is that it's not the pace of automation that's speeding up. It's really that rates of industrial expansion are slowing down. That's what's causing this decline in employment, at least in the manufacturing sector. And one might want to know, why is this happening? Well, in the book, I talk a little bit about different ideas about what could be driving this output-led deindustrialization. So I talk about the automation story, the speed of technological change story, which I've explained why it doesn't work. I talk a little bit about stories about that focus on the evolution of demand, the idea that demand is shifting from manufacturing to services. I talk a lot about globalization and international trade as a story. And I think you could also talk about demographic factors, especially in the global South, where over this period, the labor force has been growing pretty rapidly. What I want to talk to you about here and what I really focus on in the book is the third of these, the globalization international trade story. Now, over the period that I've been describing to you, we've seen a really rapid increase in global trade. So this is a common measure of exports as a share of global GDP. And you can see a really substantial increase from the early 1970s all the way up to the present, although in a recent period, kind of stabilizing the export share of GDP. And this was supposed to, according to economists, result in major gains from trade as each country would specialize in different kinds of production and everyone would benefit from this shared prosperity. But what we actually see over this period is not a radical increase in rates of manufacturing output growth across the world, or even a stable rate of manufacturing output growth. Instead, what we see, and this is statistics from the World Trade Organization, certainly not a defender of any kind of stagnationist views, but their own statistics show that over time, there's been a substantial decline in the rate of growth of manufacturing output across the entire world. And so this isn't only a story about the rich countries. It isn't just a story about production moving from rich countries to poorer countries. It's a global stagnation or global slowdown story in the manufacturing sector. So what's going on here? Well, following economic historian Robert Brenner, as Mark mentioned, I say that globalization generated many more trade redundancies than trade complementarities. So companies were producing the same sorts of goods and competing in ever more oversupplied markets as a result. And as industrial overcapacity increased on the global scale, that in turn drove down rates of investment. It meant that output was expanding more slowly, even though companies really had to compete in productivity terms. And that's really the driving force behind both output-led deindustrialization and the corresponding loss of manufacturing jobs, and also explains why it's affected even many poorer countries. So even countries like India and China have been deindustrializing since the early 2010s. And in fact, according to the UN, the entire world has been deindustrializing as a whole since that time. Now, in a lot of ways, the story I've told you so far is just focused on manufacturing. And one could think of it as a pretty standard story that what I'm saying is I'm talking about the running down of the industrial growth engine that's been associated then with the transition from an industrial to a service-based economy. And the question is, are services going to see this radical automation that I've shown you hasn't really been happening in industry? So now I'm going to consider the services case. And basically, what is less frequently mentioned when talking about the growth of the service economy is that it's been associated, one, with a substantial slowdown, not an increase in productivity growth rates, a corresponding major slowdown in economic growth rates, and as a result, a persistently low demand for labor over this period. Just to give you a little sense of what I'm saying about this, we could just look at those same statistics of output, productivity, and employment growth that I showed you earlier with regard to the manufacturing sector. So here you see just from 1950 to 79, that during the heyday of the industrial economy, productivity growth in core industries was fast, right? So we had a fast growing productivity growth in industry, but output growth was even faster. And that resulted in steady job creation because output growth was faster than productivity growth. So it meant that jobs expanded. Today, and for quite some time now, the economy has been selecting these high productivity growth jobs in manufacturing for steady employment losses. Meanwhile, in the service sector, which was supposed to replace manufacturing as a growth driver, what we see is that output has also been growing at a slower pace than before, but productivity growth is even slower than before. So this sector is adding jobs, but the economy, in expanding into services, has been selecting low productivity growth jobs for steady expansion. What we see across both the USA, or across all three of the USA, Germany, and Japan, is not a recent increase in productivity growth in services associated with any radical entry of new automation technologies into the sector, but rather a very significant slowdown in average productivity growth rates across all three economies, extremely significant, as these countries have seen a shift from manufacturing to services. So, and as that's happened, because productivity growth is a major component of overall output growth, we've seen a really substantial decline as well in rates of overall output, or GDP. And here you can just see that, on the left-hand side, MVA, that's the rate of growth of manufacturing, the manufacturing sector. As it's declined, so too has overall GDP growth rates. And note, as I mentioned before, that since 2000, the German export machine has recovered to some extent, but we don't really see evidence of that as much in the overall economy, because over this period, manufacturing has itself become a much smaller sector of the economy. So it's had less of an effect. And therefore, we see this long-term trend of secular stagnation. And the result of this, as I mentioned before, a persistently low demand for labor, as indicated, for example, in higher average unemployment rates in the United States, as well as all the other phenomena that I mentioned earlier: underemployment, workers getting jobs with lower wages than before, workers not using the skills that they've acquired, and so on. Now, in a slow-growing economy, as I suggested earlier, workers face a low demand for their labor. But in the book, in later chapters, I talk about who and how experiences that differs really substantially across countries. I talk about the OECD Index of Employee Protection, which measures the degree to which workers are protected from being fired, arbitrary, or dismissed by their employers. And it's just an index that ranges from 0 to 6, and it rates countries on how protected workers are from dismissal. And you can kind of see here that the United States has the lowest rate, really incredibly low rates of protection for workers. And what that means is that as the economy has grown more slowly and as average unemployment rates have risen, workers across the economy have just felt substantially more insecure. In countries like Japan and Germany, as well as Italy and France, workers who have permanent jobs tend to be much more protected from dismissal. So even though unemployment is high, workers who already have secure jobs tend not to see as many consequences for that. They can still fight for higher wages. And in those countries, instead of generalized or widespread insecurity, what we see is insecurity that's really focused in a precarious, insecurely employed sector that's legally segregated into temporary and fixed contract jobs. Now, just to summarize what I've said very quickly, is this the end of work? Is the automation story true? No, the pace of technologically induced job destruction is not actually speeding up, as those theorists suggest. In reality, economic growth rates are slowing down, and that's reduced the rate at which new jobs are being created. And it's this lack of job creation rather than an acceleration in the pace of job destruction that is at fault for labor market slack. This resulting low demand for labor provides a fundamental backdrop to the expanding digital economy. It reduces workers' bargaining power vis-a-vis employers. It affects the costs and benefits of firms' investment decisions and really frees them from having to care very much about their workers. And the result is that workers end up with little say in how digital work processes are structured. In the book, I go on from that analysis to talk a lot about the conditions of the global workforce outside of the core countries, especially looking at informal employment. And I consider a range of different alternative hypotheses about how to get out of stagnation. So I talk about the preferred story of the automation theorists, which is, of course, universal basic income. I talk about the idea of Keynesian, turning as we are perhaps now in the United States toward a more substantial Keynesian demand management. I talk about neoliberal structural adjustment and the effects that's had. And I also propose a radical alternative for how we might respond to living in an age of secular stagnation. That's kind of more flighty and utopian in nature, though I will defend it if you want to hear about it. So thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to ask or your comments.
Great, thank you very much for that. And right on time, which is fabulous. I've actually got many questions I'd love to ask myself, but we have 3 in the Q&A and more will probably arrive. So we're going to do a podcast later, which I hope that you will all listen to when it's up in about a week's time. In the meantime, I'm going to jump straight to the Q&A. So the first question that we've got here comes from, excuse me if I mispronounce, Ture Martic. What is your take on artificial intelligence in service and retail industries, knowing a lot of people will come out of the pandemic with an increased liking for face-to-face interaction? So how about some post-pandemic prognostication?
Great, yeah. I mean, yeah, so when I was writing the book, I was really looking for examples of companies that were responding to the corona crisis by investing massively in robots and AI and so on. And the one really big example I found was Walmart, which said, hey, we're going to invest massively in robots to respond to this crisis. And what was amazing is that by the time, between the time I finished the book manuscript and it went to press, Walmart actually quietly released a statement saying they had actually decided not to do that and to pull back on their investment in robots. And in general, I think that's probably likely to be what a lot of companies are going to do. They're going to make minor adjustments to production, but they're not going to make the kind of major investments that would be required to really transform work for the reasons that I've already described. That is to say, in a much slower economy and facing incredible instability and uncertainty about the future of demand, those companies are going to be pretty cautious about what they do. Now, that's an economic side of the story. More recently, I've been looking a lot into the technical side, in which I have a lot less expertise. And for those who are interested, I really recommend a book by Gary Marcus called Rebooting AI that talks about the limits of current machine learning programming. There was this idea that the kinds of programs, the machine learning and deep learning and neural networks, that they're getting more and more accurate, and that with more processing power, they'll close the gap with human beings and really be able to replace human labor. Increasingly, Gary Marcus was an early critic of this, but increasingly researchers at Google and MIT are also admitting that the idea that you can get machine learning to be functionally human in intelligence just with more processing power just isn't true. And what that means is that there's going to be a lot of roles for human beings in production for a very long time. We don't really know how to replace human beings with AI, and nothing we're doing right now suggests that it's around the corner.
Great, thanks for that. Next question. Colin Haller asks, is the demand decline in any way correlated to the austerity bias we have historically seen in government spending? So in other words, if you basically got rid of the austerity bias and went on a big spending spree, which is what we seem to be doing now, is this actually going to change those fundamental relationships that you point to?
You know, I am really interested to find out. I mean, I think it's an incredibly interesting moment. We are seeing a really dramatic change in spending and a kind of rejection of the debt break, as it were, as they call it in Germany, or the constraints of the debt. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens. So, my account would suggest that in the end, you'll obviously get a big bump from that, but that bump won't be long lasting in character unless you really see a dramatic change in the international economic environment. So, as an example, in the late 1980s, American companies started to see a real bump, both through massive military Keynesian spending by the Reagan government, as well as a fall in the value of the dollar and real compression of workers' wages. And yet it took a very long time before companies responded to that with major investments. And you did see a real bump in growth in the early 1990s, but then changes in the global market conditions that really negatively impacted US companies' international competitiveness result in a really massive drop in investment again. And that's how we got the bubble economies and so on. So I think it's going to take more than that to get out of this condition, that we really are stuck in a kind of long-term secular stagnation that has a kind of structural basis. But I am so excited to see what happens with the change in policy right now, what effect that could have.
Cool. We've got tons of questions, and I'm just going to ask them all in the podcast. So you will get all of your questions asked because they're really good.
Okay.
Katja Kleinberg's got a really good one that piggybacks on what Colin just asked, which is, are there baseline differences in the potential for productivity growth across sectors? All right. And if so, to what extent are they inherent, or are they a product of policy making? So it's not just a question of, we spend more, you get more demand, that solves your overaccumulation problem. Are there specific sectors you're going to get more bang for your buck? And can we do something about that to solve the jobs crisis?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I am a big proponent of the idea that there are major differences in growth potentials across sectors. I'm really drawing on the work of William Baumol, who used to be the head of the American Economics Association, really interesting thinker. Check out his work on the Baumol cost disease. He suggests it's not an inherent relationship necessarily, but it's a long-term kind of observed relationship that manufacturing sectors, because they are industrialized. And we saw this also in agriculture in the mid-20th century. The massive industrialization of agriculture overcame long-term impediments to productivity growth in that sector. Industrializing is a way to produce sustained, dramatic and dynamic changes in productivity. And that's been the major source of growth in countries that are developed over the 19th and 20th centuries. The service sector seems to have a real impediment to that kind of change, precisely because services tend not to be amenable to industrializing. Of course, we've seen some services that look more like industry, like think about McDonald's to some extent, or the new Amazon warehouses. But in general, services have proven resistant to that kind of industrialization. And as a result, they've had endemically slow productivity growth over time. And so part of what I'm saying is that marks a kind of structural limit on our ability to solve what are ultimately social and distributional problems through pushing up economic growth rates.
Right. Two people on the brown list and two people on the outside list coming from YouTube Live are basically asking, oh, come on, tell us something more about solutions. And you started that. So let's get into that a little bit more. Tony Levinus, if I understand you right, secular stagnation is largely here to stay. So do say something about your utopian strategy. And similarly, Lila Rodenbeck says, what's your proposal to solve the question of the low demand for labor? Jumping over here, someone has basically said, it was Jameson Boyd, I really enjoyed the book. I really enjoyed your criticism of UBI. So can you take us on a little tour? What's your critique of UBI, Universal Basic Income, and what do you think would work instead?
Yeah. Well, whenever I talk about UBI, I talk about why I think it's so appealing first, because I think it is a really interesting proposal. And the reason why it's so appealing, especially in a place like the United States, is because we have a long history of means testing our benefits for welfare. And that's a product of, the racist organization of the US state and the US welfare state, as well as just a long history of kind of anti-poor welfare programs. And so, means testing means that people who are already suffering have to suffer even more and go through a lot of complicated process to get benefits. Universal benefits are different than that because they're just provided basically to everyone, or everyone who asks can access them without difficulty. And that would be a major change for poor people. And in general, giving poor people more stuff is going to be a good thing compared to giving them nothing. The question is whether increasing UBI will solve a lot of these problems. And my claim is that it won't, for the same reasons that affect other kinds of welfare programs. So we've lived in a long era of slowing growth, and that means that states have really faced a lot of pressure around providing services. That's become very contentious to increase services when the economy is growing more slowly. And that, of course, has really terrible expressions like austerity regimes. And as a result of this, I don't think UBI is likely to be implemented in the really expansive sense that people in the center left and left want. It's much more likely, if it is implemented, to look like a right-wing version where it replaces existing welfare programs and it remains at a low level. And it tends to kind of be a support for companies that want to employ people in really precarious and exploitative ways, rather than as a support for workers demanding higher incomes and higher wages. So that's my immediate take on UBI. As for alternatives to that, I really think that what we need, on the one hand, is to think about how we just need to work less. So we have to reduce and transform the work that people are doing and share the kinds of meaningful work that there is to be done in the economy, and for everyone to work less. That in itself, alongside empowering workers, however, won't be enough. We really have to change the character of how we do investment in this country and what the basis is of investment and who controls the investment function. So here, I think in some ways there's a kind of, you could think of a spectrum of thinkers, from radical Keynesians who think, look, we can't simply see government spending as a way to support private investment. The government has to get into the driver's seat. We need to have a public investment-driven economy, all the way to more radical kind of utopian and Marxist and other kind of solutions that say, look, this isn't just about public investment. It's really about devolving control over that investment to democratic bodies of people, so that the average everyday people are actually having a lot more decision-making power over the investment that takes place. And it's taken away from small coterie of highly wealthy individuals who use it, to make profits, and really start to transform not just our economy, but our society in ways that promote sustainability and justice and reduced work for everyone. So if you want to look at the longer proposal, definitely check out the book. And also I have an article in Logic magazine with the very kind of, with the title, How to Make a Pencil.
So we've got a few minutes left. I'm going to pile a bunch of questions together. Oddly, three of them
I'll go
fit together perfectly, right? So treat this as one, right? Although there's different aspects. So the first one is Josh Price. Hi, Josh. Thanks to Aaron, we'll definitely read the book. How compelling do you find these two accounts as part of the story of productivity slowdown and even greater output slowdown? Number one, Robert Gordon, right, on the specialness of the 20th century. And then the sort of more sociological critique of financialization, which basically leads to sort of profits and rents without any actual production. So first of all, there's that. Eric Piner asks a slightly different version of this, which is the following. It's about the Brenner overcapacity argument, which is at the base of all of this. If it's really about overcapacity as opposed to insufficient demand, would not a great number of firms have relocated their production not to be redundant at either some point in the 40 years since the 1970s, 80s, trying to obviate the overcapacity problem? The problem seems to be more that they can't, because globally there's no consumption to match the production. So it's not, in a sense, there's a supply side bias to your analysis, in that you take the overaccumulation as the problem, but there is a demand side solution. And then Thomas Slate throws right in very quickly on that one. To what extent is the downward pressure on wages simply strangled potential consumption growth? So Robert Gordon, financialization, and isn't it just demand? That's really where we are.
Yeah, great. Okay, I'll try to be brief with those. So I find the Robert Gordon story really interesting, but he's weirdly, to me, he's like the inverse of the automation theorists, right? He's just looking at it as a pure technology story. In my view, it's really a story about economic conditions and investment, and where, whether firms are actually doing investment. There's a Caldor growth law called Verdorn's law, which says that the higher the rate of output growth, the higher the rate of productivity growth. And I think that's probably the way this relationship goes, that is to say, if we saw much more investment, we would see more productivity growth. It's not just a story about technological rundown. On the financialization story, I guess I'm, maybe in the minority, but a strong minority that says that financialization is much more an effect of the lack of investment opportunities than a cause. That as those opportunities are drying up, a lot more money is remaining, a lot more investment, a lot of savings is remaining in more liquid forms in financial assets and contributing to financial instability. But getting out of that situation isn't just about strangling finance, although I do think that we should take away a lot of that money and really increase equality, but that's not the core of the story. Now, what is the core? Is it a supply side story or a demand side story? Wouldn't it be the case that if companies were experiencing this constraint of overcapacity, that they would sort of get out of industry? And I think there are limits to Bob's account. I don't follow it exactly as he did in the Economics of Global Turbulence book. In part, that's because I think that on the one hand, as Bob did later, stressed in later books, it's not just a story about overcapacity in the existing industries, it's also a story about the massive replication of technological capacities across the world. So even though basically companies have been leaving overcapacitated or oversupplied lines in the US, we've seen massive entry into those lines, right? First by Japan, and then South Korea, and then China, now Vietnam and Bangladesh and India and so on. So there's massive entry, and that's just clogging up manufacturing. And that applies not just to old lines of production like TVs, but even very new lines of production like LCD screens and computer chips are massively oversupplied through this major entry, as much as older and more traditional lines like auto. At the same time, I think Bob neglects the extent to which industrialization itself industry is itself a really unique sector. And what we've seen is a lot of movement into services and other sectors of the economy that just can't generate, even though they're protected from international trade dynamics, they are incapable of generating rapid growth. And that's also why I just think that if you combine the Brenner story and the Baumol story, you have a more complete account of the kind of supply side structural dynamics that are limiting what's going on in the economy. That is not to say, though, that the demand story isn't fundamentally important. It's very true that as we've seen the slowdown, and as companies everywhere have responded to increase competition by hammering their workers and reducing not just rates of investment, but holding down wages, we've definitely seen demand side gaps, and that is further reducing the potential growth rate of the economy. Combine that with bubbles that pop and leave overhangs of debt, and you have a really you have that long-term decline story. Whether we'll get out of it with major spending like we're seeing now, I think is a really interesting question. And my focus, I'm skeptical that it will happen, but whatever happens, I think the real thing that we need to focus on is thinking about how to democratize control and how to involve many more people in decisions about what kind of investments take place.
We've got 3 minutes left and so many questions, which is totally unfortunate. There's a couple of people that have been pushing this angle, and I'm just going to throw this out because I'm not sure it's fair to have expected to have that many thoughts on this one. As the price of carbon goes up, costs go up, investment will go down. Is there a kind of a trap here that we fall into, that basically the transition to the post-carbon economy itself becomes productivity minus? Do we get, so there's another way that we can have secular stagnation. It's not just the fact that we need to do this transit, that as the carbon price goes up, basically firms are going to get even more hammered on profits, and it's going to make the situation even more complex. Any thoughts on that in closing?
Yeah, no, I think that there are a lot of reasons. Look, we need to transition away from the fossil fuel economy. The idea that we're going to be able to do that and sustain or recover high rates of growth and in a kind of most optimistic version of the Green New Deal, I just don't think that that is likely, basically for the reason you suggested, that fossil fuel was a fundamental part of the rapid growth economy. But that just means that we need to face more clearly the political struggles and conflicts that rapid growth has hidden in an earlier era, and that the absence of growth has really brought to the fore. Those struggles over the character of what we produce, over how much people work and how much they're subservient to their employers. All of those questions, those are the questions that we're forced to deal with because of secular stagnation. And I'll just emphasize that what I like about the automation theorists is precisely that they're looking at this and trying, in the face of the kind of, pessimism of that situation, to give a really optimistic story about our future as a species. Now, they find their optimism in a tendency in technology. And my account is that we can find that optimism instead in our capacity to reorganize society in a way that really leads to people working less, having a lot more say over their futures, and in which slower aggregate growth on the whole does not lead to really negative outcomes for people's lives and make them deeply insecure in their work. So that's my closing pitch.
That's a great closer, and it's exactly what I'm going to pick up on the podcast in a little while with you, because it's exactly the area we need to press on. How do we actually make that happen for everyone? All right, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. I was immediately told by Hayden, who actually runs the Rhodes Center, that you're in fact not the last person that we have giving a talk, because we have some specialist workshops coming in and they have a public talk associated with them. Do check out our website for details of that, and also check my Twitter feed, mkblythe at Twitter, and you'll get the details there. But again, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Adam. It's been a fabulous talk.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.